Good afternoon. I'm very pleased to be here this afternoon to provide a status report on U.S. efforts to protect and restore the Great Lakes. And I'd like to begin by concurring with the stark assessment of the environmental conditions in the Great Lakes that we just saw in the film clip a few minutes ago. The largest freshwater system in the world faces many environmental threats. Some, like emerging chemicals of concern, are new. Others are very old. There are still many locations where legacy contamination from persistent bioaccumulative toxins like PCBs, mercury, and dioxin can be found at levels of concern for people and for wildlife. In 1987, the areas of concern were identified to target the locations with the largest legacies of toxic pollution. So far, only one AOC has been delisted on the U.S. side of the border. AOC cleanup is complex for many reasons, jurisdictionally, environmentally, and the sheer cost, which includes the cost of cleaning up an estimated 43 million cubic yards of contaminated sediment. Many of our coastal areas suffer from combined sewer overflows that contaminate water and cause beach closures. Non-point source pollution from urban and agricultural runoff is also a major contributor to nearshore problems in the Great Lakes. In addition to altering the food web, excessive nutrient loadings cause harmful algal blooms. Past and ongoing development has compromised habitat in the Great Lakes. The Great Lakes have lost more than half of the region's original wetlands and 60% of forest lands. And the region has only small remnants of other habitat types such as savanna and prairie. These changes in habitat type and extent have contributed to the loss of numerous plants and animal species throughout the Great Lakes Basin. At the same time we're losing native species, the Great Lakes are being attacked by invasive species. These invasive species disrupt the food web and cause billions of dollars of damage to infrastructure and to the fishery. Over 160 invasive species now exist in the Great Lakes. Perhaps the most well-known of these is the zebra mussel or quagga mussels. And a more recent menace to the Great Lakes ecosystem is the Asian carp. To address this long list of problems, President Obama announced the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative, the largest investment in the Great Lakes in over 2 decades. And despite everything that you're hearing about gridlock in Washington, I am very pleased to report that this initiative received and continues to receive strong bipartisan support from the Great Lakes congressional delegation. The Great Lakes Restoration Initiative is a coordinated, multi-agency effort led by an interagency task force, which just met a couple of hours ago here in Detroit, and a regional working group, which I chair, that coordinates federal Great Lakes activities. The interagency task force includes 11 of the agency and cabinet organizations that manage 140 separate programs focused on the Great Lakes. This includes EPA, the State Department, Department of Interior, the Agriculture Department, Department of Commerce, Housing and Urban Development, Transportation, Homeland Security, Health and Human Services, the Army, and the Council on Environmental Quality. As chair of the regional working group, I've had an opportunity to see these agencies, many of which didn't even talk to each other in the past, now working together to tackle the threats to the Great Lakes that I described a few minutes ago. In February 2010, the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative Action Plan was developed to advance the implementation of the initiative through 2014. The action plan centers on the most urgent Great Lakes issues, including toxic substances and areas of concern, invasive species, nearshore health and non-point source pollution, habitat and wildlife protection and restoration, and the need for accountability, which is what this session is about, education, monitoring, evaluation, communication, and partnerships, which is what all of Great Lakes Week is about. On an annual basis, the federal agencies involved in the GLRI identify the specific actions they will take to implement the action plan. Congress requested an independent scientific panel to review the scientific credibility of the plan to optimize the likelihood of successful restoration at appropriate scales. So in 2011, the EPA Science Advisory Board formed an ad hoc panel of scientific experts to review the action plan, which is making recommendations to assist with implementation of the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative. One of the key Great Lakes Restoration Initiative programs is the Great Lakes Legacy Act, which focuses on cleaning areas of concern. So far, we've completed 10 Legacy Act cleanups and removed more than 1.3 million cubic yards of contaminated settlement. One successful Legacy Act cleanup has been in the Ashtabula River in Ohio, where 500,000 cubic yards of sediment have been remediated and 25,000 pounds of PCBs have been removed. We also restored shoreline habitat with native vegetation and created shallow water habitat and fish spawning areas. In partnership with local businesses and the Ashtabula Port Authority, we were able to deepen the river, allowing for commercial and recreational boating that will generate long-term revenue for the port. As a result of this work, the port has been reopened to larger vessels, the shorelines have been restored, and people have come back to the area to recreate. Another significant Legacy Act project focused on the west branch of the Grand Calumet River in Hammond, Indiana. In addition to cleaning up 77,000 cubic yards of contaminated sediment and removing 1.2 million pounds of oil and grease, PAHs, heavy metals, and PCBs, this project included habitat improvements in the riparian zone. This is a picture of the Grand Calumet after this cleanup work was completed. We are also making progress in the areas of concern on the U.S. side of the border. Multiple programs, Superfund, Legacy Act, and GLRI grants, and multiple agencies, the EPA, the Corps, Fish and Wildlife Service, NOAA, and others, are being strategically deployed to remove beneficial use impairments in AOCs across the Great Lakes Basin. Working in collaboration with our state partners, we have identified 4 AOCs, the ones that you just heard Administrator Jackson, where through focused efforts supported by we will be able to complete by the end of this fiscal year. The first AOC targeted for completion in 2012 is the Ashtabula River AOC. When the Ashtabula River Legacy Act project I just described was finished, EPA partnered with a number of state and federal agencies to identify the steps needed to complete work at this AOC. EPA is working with the Corps of Engineers to conduct a strategic navigation dredging project for 2 sections of the river. EPA also provided a 2010 GLRI habitat restoration grant to address the habitat BUIs at this area of concern. And when this sediment remediation work and habitat restoration work is finished, which is scheduled to happen no later than September 2012, all management actions needed to delist this AOC will be completed. After the work is done, EPA will monitor environmental conditions in the Ashtabula River AOC until any remaining BUIs are removed. The second AOC that has been targeted for completion in fiscal year 2012 is the River Raisin AOC, located in Monroe, Michigan. There's a lot of work going on in this AOC. EPA provided 3 separate habitat restoration grants under the 2010 GLRI grant program for this AOC, and the Michigan Department of Environmental Quality is working with local partners to complete the 2 remaining habitat restoration projects here. The Corps has completed a strategic navigation dredging project in the river, and EPA is working with MDEQ to use Legacy Act funding to remediate additional contaminated sediment in the river. When this sediment remediation and habitat restoration work is complete during fiscal year 2012, all management actions will be completed at this AOC. And again, when the work is done, EPA will continue to monitor conditions in the Raisin River until all remaining BUIs are removed. The third AOC that has been targeted for completion in FY12 is the White Lake AOC, which is located on the eastern shore of Lake Michigan. EPA actually conducted sediment remediation in the White Lake AOC before the Legacy Act was enacted, so all the sediment issues have been resolved at this AOC. In 2010, EPA awarded the local Soil and Conservation District a $2.1 million GLRI habitat restoration grant, and the habitat restoration work is scheduled to be finished in fiscal year 12, completing the final management actions needed at this AOC. And again, after the work is done, EPA will continue to monitor environmental conditions until all BUIs are removed. The final AOC that has been targeted for completion in FY12 is the Sheboygan River AOC near Sheboygan, Wisconsin. This AOC is co-located with a Superfund site. Superfund cleanup activities are currently underway. A Legacy Act project and an Army Corps of Engineers strategic navigation dredging project are planned for 2012. This will complete all remaining sediment cleanup work needed in this AOC. EPA also provided GLRI funding to the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources to conduct a $5 million habitat restoration program to remove BUIs in this AOC. By being strategic with GLRI grants, Legacy Act funding, and Superfund dollars, the partners working on this site will be able to complete all of the remaining sediment remediation and habitat restoration work needed in this AOC by September 2012. And again, when the work is finished, EPA will continue to monitor environmental conditions until any remaining BUIs can be removed. After work is completed on these 4 AOCs in 2012, we have identified 5 more AOCs that we will target for completion in 2013 and 2014. As Administrator Jackson mentioned, the 5 are Deer Lake in Michigan, Manistee Harbor in Michigan, Waukegan Harbor in Illinois, the St. Mary's River in Michigan, and the St. Clair River in Michigan. And there may be other AOCs where strategically targeted projects will lead to near-term BUI removal and/or AOC delisting. And we would welcome suggestions from our partners if you know of any such opportunities. Work funded by the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative is also significantly improving the health of the Great Lakes nearshore areas by reducing non-point source pollution in Great Lakes Basin watersheds. The Great Lakes Restoration Action Plan identifies 5 watersheds targeted for action. One is the Fox River, the Saginaw River, the Maumee River, the St. Louis River, and the Genesee River. In 2010 and 2011, more than 50 million GLRI dollars went to the Natural Resources Conservation Service to expand conservation and soil erosion reduction programs in impaired Great Lakes watersheds. As of June 2011, using more than 12 million GLRI dollars, NRCS has entered into more than 350 environmental quality incentive programs and Conservation Technical Assistant Program contracts, affecting more than 75,000 acres of land in these watersheds. Through a cooperative agreement with the Great Lakes Commission, more than $4.3 million in additional grants were awarded through the Great Lakes Basin Program for Soil Erosion and Sediment Control Program. In 2012, EPA, NRCS, and the U.S. Geological Survey plan to intensify efforts in 3 of the 5 targeted watersheds: the Maumee River's Blanchard River watershed, the Fox River's Lower Fox River watershed, and the Saginaw River's Flint River watershed. Now, combined sewer overflows are another major source of pollution in many impaired Great Lakes watersheds and are a significant source of contamination along the nearshore waters of the Great Lakes. During periods of heavy rainfall or snowmelt, wastewater volume in combined sewer systems can exceed the capacity of the sewer system or the treatment plant, and untreated human and industrial waste, toxic materials, and debris are discharged into the Great Lakes and Great Lakes tributaries. CSOs transport bacteria, viruses, toxic chemicals, and other pollutants that can harm drinking water sources, fisheries, beaches, and other recreational resources. Large volume untreated CSOs frequently contained E. coli and fecal coliform colony forming units in quantities that are orders of magnitude above water quality criteria for E. coli and fecal coliform. This photo shows the impact of an extreme rain event that triggered the release of millions of gallons of combined stormwater and sewage through the Chicago locks into Lake Michigan. This type of release has occurred several times during the past several years during extreme rainfalls, a weather event which we're seeing more frequently in the Midwest. Region 5, working with Region 5 states, has used a variety of tools to address sewer overflows, including enforcement, permitting, and by funding gray water infrastructure through state revolving fund loans, and by funding voluntary green infrastructure projects with GLRI and non-point source grants. The CSO enforcement actions that Region 5 completed in fiscal year 2011 will eliminate approximately 7.4 billion gallons of sewage from our waterways each year. This is a significant increase over past years. For instance, fiscal year 10 settlements reached only about, or I shouldn't say only, but reached 250 million gallons of sewage. The settlements finalized in 2011 will also result in reductions of over 370,000 pounds of nitrogen and 75,000 pounds of phosphorus annually. Let me give you a few examples of EPA's effort to pick up the pace in this area. During fiscal year 11, EPA and the state of Ohio entered into a settlement with the Northeast Ohio Regional Sewer District that requires the construction of 7 tunnel systems that will reduce Cleveland area discharges of raw sewage into Lake Erie by more than 4 billion gallons a year. As a result of the settlement, NEORSD will also construct large-scale green infrastructure projects to help control wet weather sewer discharges that will capture an additional 44 million gallons a year. And these green infrastructure projects will help to return vacant properties to productive uses, thus revitalizing Cleveland neighborhoods. EPA also has a consent decree with Toledo requiring the construction of a 25 million gallon storage basin and implementing a long-term control plan that will eliminate Toledo's serious CSO problem by 2020. During fiscal year 11, EPA and the state of Minnesota negotiated a consent decree that requires the city of Duluth to eliminate unpermitted SSO and bypass discharges into the St. Louis River, a tributary of Lake Superior. EPA has had a CSO control policy since 1994. That policy has required combined sewer systems to develop long-term control plans that lead to attainment of water quality standards. This policy was codified by the Wet Weather Water Quality Act of 2000. As a result of the Clean Water Act enforcement actions like the ones I just described, 39 of the large CSO systems in Region 5, those serving over 50,000 people, now comply with this law. We are actively working on the remaining 23 large CSO systems in Region 5, and we expect to complete some of those cases this year. The U.S. government has also made significant progress in the fight against invasive species that threaten the Great Lakes, including Asian carp, which are the most acute aquatic invasive species threat in the Great Lakes today. We are truly fortunate that Great Lakes Restoration Initiative is available at this time. The GLRI is supporting Asian carp eDNA monitoring and eradication efforts by federal, state, and local agencies when potential populations are detected. The GLRI is also supporting the development of innovative control technologies to help contain, control, and kill Asian carp populations. Our work continues to address invasive species already present in the Great Lakes, including the sea lamprey. While sea lamprey populations are about 10% of their historic highs, there are still 400,000 lamprey in the Great Lakes. GLRI funds have been used to expand sea lamprey control efforts, to construct additional sea lamprey barriers, and to pilot new trapping technologies. One new technology, the use of chemical attractants that mimic sea lamprey pheromones, have improved trapping rates by about 25% and are estimated to have saved approximately 200,000 pounds of fish in the Great Lakes. GLRI funds are also being used to combat terrestrial invasive species, including the invasive Phragmites that thrive in the interface of land and lake. This plant spreads aggressively through seeds and fast-growing roots, quickly crowding out native plants. The resulting monoculture provides poor habitat for native waterfowl and other wildlife. The GLRI is supporting federal, state, and local efforts to control this plant throughout the region. There are many impressive partnerships implementing these projects, restoring several thousands of acres of Great Lakes coastal wetlands and shoreline. Prevention continues to be a major focus of our efforts to combat invasive species. We've partnered with Great Lakes states and universities to continue outreach efforts to recreational boaters and resource users. And many of you have probably seen our billboards, pamphlets, and television programs that remind you to clean, drain, and dry. GLRI funding is also supporting the development and performance testing of ballast water technologies. We cannot rely on technology developed for the saltwater oceans. We need to ensure that there is technology that is protective of the colder, salt-free waters of the Great Lakes. I should note that EPA is currently in the process of reissuing our vessel general permit. As part of that process, we're reviewing 2 reports that EPA commissioned to ensure that the new permit is based on the best available science. Those reports are a report from EPA's Independent Science Advisory Board, which evaluates ballast water technology, and another report from the National Research Council and National Academy of Sciences that evaluates the risks posed by ballast water discharges. Both of those reports are available on the EPA website. We plan to propose a draft of the next vessel general permit for public comment by December of this year. Some of the recent work that the U.S. government has done to protect the Great Lakes in recent years has been in the form of emergency response actions, most notably last summer, when EPA led the response to the Enbridge oil spill in the Kalamazoo River, a major Lake Michigan tributary. In July 2010, a 30-inch oil pipeline ruptured near Marshall, Michigan. This oil spill, initially estimated at over 800,000 gallons and since revised upward, entered Talmadge Creek and flowed into the Kalamazoo River, a Lake Michigan tributary. Heavy rains caused the river to overtop existing dams and carried oil, which you can see here covering the entire surface of the river, over 30 miles downstream. As the federal agency in charge of this oil spill response, EPA assumed a leadership role in the Unified Command and mobilized an incident management team made up of federal, state, and local agencies. Within 2 days, the spill was contained, approximately 80 river miles from Lake Michigan. While we are able to recover our costs for responding to oil spills, continuing to advance restoration of the Great Lakes is dependent on funding from the federal budget. We don't know what future GLRI funding levels will be. But we do know it's important to Congress and stakeholders to focus on these 3 issues: cleaning up AOCs, restoring tributaries affected by nutrients, preventing introduction of new invasive species. In the future, EPA will continue working closely with states and communities on comprehensive roadmaps for each AOC. And as mentioned earlier, we have targeted 4 AOCs in 2012 and 5 additional AOCs for 2013 and 2014, where we believe it is possible to complete the work required for delisting. In 2012, the focus will be on the Sheboygan River AOC, the Raisin River AOC, the Ashtabula River AOC, and the White Lake AOC. And in 2013 and 2014, we will be focusing on the Manistee Harbor AOC, the Deer Lake AOC, the St. Clair River AOC, the St. Mary's River AOC, and the Waukegan Harbor AOC. During the next 2 years, we will be targeting 3 priority watersheds for phosphorus reduction: the Maumee River's Blanchard River watershed, the Fox River's Lower Fox River watershed, and the Saginaw River's Flint River watershed. We will also focus heavily on aquatic invasive species. And we will continue to do as many additional Great Lakes Restoration Initiative projects as possible around the Great Lakes. The GLRI website has an interactive map that you can use to find out about the many GLRI projects I haven't had time to discuss today, and to get a sense of the range of projects that have been funded so far and that we hope to be able to fund in the future, including projects like the 8 restoration projects announced last week that will produce immediate, direct ecological benefits and will use a Conservation Corps model to put unemployed people back to work. Again, we don't know what future GLRI funding levels will be, but we do know that we will focus on critical locations where we can demonstrate real progress. We will protect this valuable source of drinking water for more than 42 million people. We'll protect and restore the Great Lakes for the 9 million anglers and 5 million hunters and 23 million bird watchers in this region, a region where, as has been noted earlier, over 4 million recreational vessels are registered, the most in any part of the country, and people spend nearly $16 billion on boating trips and equipment each year. The Great Lakes are a vital part of the U.S. and the Canadian economy. They support more than, well, you heard the administrator say, probably more than 1.5 million manufacturing, shipping, agricultural, tourism, and recreation jobs, generating at least $62 billion in wages in this region. But in addition to their instrumental value, the Great Lakes must be protected for their intrinsic value. They are truly one of the world's natural wonders. We have to do our part to restore these Great Lakes for the next generation and the next generation after that, for 7 generations. Thank you for your part in helping us to do that. Thank you for your attention this afternoon and for participating in the first ever Great Lakes Week. Thank you.